Welcome. Thanks for all staying so late. This must be the real hardcore. You're in the city of the best beer in the world, and you're still here listening to talks. I'm super impressed. And we're talking about yet another UI library. Really? Do you need to hear about another UI library at this time of night? Well, we had to write one, and so let me just tell you a little bit about our motivation for writing the library. I want to first sort of take a step back and look at. I'll take a step back and look at actually what has stood the test of time in web technologies and UI libraries over the time. Really, the web technology which stands out is really HTML. I mean, we all know it. It's been around since Tim Berners-Lee invented it in the early 90s. Most of us use it. We kind of have an understanding of what it does. We expect UL to be followed by LI. We kind of know what an input field does. It's a standard that has evolved, but clearly it stood the test of time. And it's a fantastic base to build applications. So many years ago, we did this with HTML, and it was pretty painful. Then along came jQuery, and wow, it was so much better. Then more comprehensive frameworks started to appear, like Knockout, Backbone, Angular, and you could now move the thing to a higher level of abstraction. You could use libraries for doing drop-downs and including data in tables without coding every aspect of this stuff yourself. However, would you now bet your next job on learning Knockout or Angular? Probably not. So I guess most people here have been through the effort of moving applications between these frameworks. And it's pretty tough. I mean, the frameworks have different concepts, different APIs, and you end up, although you're just sort of changing the framework, you end up actually doing a whole lot of deep refactoring. And it's really pretty unpleasant. So, one second. So, at the same time, the sort of frameworks are changing. The other thing which is happening is there's now a common understanding of how most of the actual building blocks of the web should work. We all know what a menu does. We all know what a modal dialog does. We kind of expect to be able to navigate through a menu with arrow keys. We expect maybe to have a few icons in the menu and submenus. There are the variations for sure. But the pattern's pretty clear, and if you suddenly find an application which does something really strange with a menu, it's annoying at the very least, and sometimes it's actually difficult to use. So, just to sort of summarize that lot, we have sort of two sort of classes of problem. We have the fact that frameworks are changing pretty quickly. We've moved from jQuery to Knockout to Angular to React, and the business logic gets somehow mashed into the display layer. It just happens. And untangling that is a huge effort. And secondly, we're constantly having to reinvent the wheel for these components like menus. You think menus are nice, simple thing, but actually when you consider writing a menu which really does submenus, is really accessible, actually has the right ARIA roles and screen readers that can actually read, and you can navigate with all the keyboards, it's not a trivial task, but we keep reinventing it for every single framework. And finally, the frameworks all bring in their own sort of language and concepts. And so it's a learning curve between each one. So Stardust was an attempt to make a framework agnostic, standardized library which uses the sort of well-defined concepts and naming conventions. So we've looked at a whole lot of libraries, and we're trying to use the naming and conventions and the behaviors which have evolved through those libraries over time. Those are things which we don't think are going to change. And the frameworks probably will change, but at least the behaviors of how a menu work is probably not going to change very quickly. So how do we make a framework agnostic UI? Well, so our approach is to abstract out a lot of these things. And the way we do that is we rely only on the JavaScript and HTML. They're standards, they're always there. What does that actually mean in practice? So let's take the menu again as an example. What do we need to code a menu? A menu has items, it sometimes has sub-items, it sometimes has icons, we need a few callbacks. There's a lot of stuff there. It's pretty much common. The framework needs to implement this. And let's dig even further and look at keyboard navigation. So keyboard navigation for a menu is easy? Well, actually, if you look at the W3 standards for accessibility, there's quite a lot of stuff to implement there. And not all of it is actually immediately obvious. So it's a known expected behavior, and so we can abstract this out. We can create code which just relies on the rendered JavaScript. It doesn't matter how it's rendered. It could be from React, it could be from Angular. And we inject into that the handlers and event handlers and so on to take the keyboard and handle a horizontal, vertical menu, a menu with sub-items and so on. And it only uses the DOM to do that. And similarly, we can do the same thing for accessibility. Accessibility covers a whole range of things, yes? And sometimes people think it's just being able to navigate with the keyboard. That's definitely one and an important part of it. But there's also actually getting the right ARIA roles and dividing the menu into the right segments so that screen readers read the information which is actually needed for disabled users to navigate through it, and actually hear not the same item twice or missing items and so on. And we spent a lot of time actually looking at the W3C best practices and testing on different screen readers in different browsers and different OSs and getting this stuff to really work nicely. I think that, and finally, the final sort of important aspect of how we make it agnostic is really not invent anything new. We're really trying, as I said before, just to reuse the common language, the common APIs, the expected behavior from all the other components. And do so in a way which is natural in language. So you expect, if you want a menu button to be highlighted, it's primary. If you want to add a description, you add a description. So I've talked about it a little about the sort of motivation for the library. Now let me hand over to Alex, who will actually talk about some code. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Does everybody hear me correctly? OK, cool. So hi, guys. I'm Alex, and today I'm going to present you a couple of demos. We are going to use, I don't know if you guys can see them. Not really. 1 second. Cool. Sorry about that. So what we are going to use here is our so-called Dockside Experience, where we provide a list of the components that we are using in Stardust. There's a list here on the left navigation bar, and for each of these, we are using our built-in code editor, live code editor, where we can actually edit the examples and see exactly how a component behaves. Hugh has mentioned the natural API language that is aimed to provide us the component's description. This is a very important goal for Stardust, to actually use natural API language in order to describe that component. So we are taking like a so-called descriptivist approach. We are looking at the world of web. We are identifying norms that stood the test of time, and we are documenting this, and we are identifying them as pillars for our components. Therefore, we are using the most common component names, and we define their anatomy by identifying the component's parts, or slots, how we call them. This gives us the opportunity to control what a component should do in terms of functionality, in terms of accessibility, but at the same time, it allows the user to have complete freedom on some other important factors, important aspects, such as component styling and the structure of the slots themselves. So let's take the attachment component here on this page. And when you think about an attachment, you basically think of a rectangle that has some text inside, which will give you an idea of what exactly this is attached to. So I'm going to open this here, and we see that, well, this is what Stardust provides. It has an attachment, and the header prop here will just offer you the text document.docx. So this is what is rendered. But then you might think, like, since we are using this naturally evolved language of the API, it becomes very predictable for me as a user, how am I going to customize this component? So I know that if I add here description, and let's say the size of this file, this will be translated into an actual DOM element that represents the description slot. So let me just expand a little bit on the slot and what it means and what it is. We are introducing this concept, and what each Stardust component is essentially a template, and each of these templates introduces slots in order to target specific areas of the component, and we are doing this during the customization. For each of these slots, there is a default component that is rendered. So if I take the example of, like, I'm thinking this could be a file attachment, and then for this I will introduce an icon. I'll specify here a name, let's say file word, and this what it will do, it will bring up, it will introduce a new slot, the attachment, the icon slot, and what it does behind the scenes, it renders here the icon component. So this will take the value, put it as the name of the component, and as the name of the subcomponent, which is the icon, and render it. We can also introduce slots using objects to describe the element that's going to be rendered. I will do this for something that's called action. So for this one, I'm going to use a JavaScript object, and I will place here icon X. So this is what you can see here on the right side. It rendered a button. You can see in the markup downstairs here. It rendered a button, and inside the button there's a UI icon with the name X. And this is rendered here. Let me add a few more things. Progress, which will introduce another slot for the progress. So you can see here at the bottom, like this 33% downloaded, let's say. And I will also bind here an on-click handler, which will, let's say, alert off clicked. And this should be a string. Okay, close this. And then I click on it, and there's the alert being propagated. Cool. So now that we have this fully customized Stardust component with all its slots defined, and if I scroll down, there's actually we have some examples prepared here in order for you to understand exactly what area is the header, where the description, the icons on the left, and the action on the right, and then there's the progress bar here at the bottom. So this is what we mentioned earlier. It's like the anatomy of the component. We defined that, but all these slots are fully customizable. So let me just prove that to you, like by taking this example, and I will go to the action slot, and I'm going to style this part. So I'm introducing the styles object here, and I'm going to change the background of this to red. But then I can do the same for any of the slots themselves, and actually for the top component itself. So here I will just change the background of this one, of the whole attachment, to, let's say, back. Do I know how to spell this? Let's make it yellow. But the customization doesn't stop here. For all of these slots, we might have some scenarios where we would like to have a specific, need, let's say, to render something different in each of these slots. So what we could do is we can actually render a plain HTML element. So for this one, in the action, there's a plain button, and you can see that the capabilities of those clicking still work, so everything, like the functionality is preserved. And moreover, we can even introduce custom components from different UI libraries. For this example, specifically, we are using a material UI button and in the action. So I can prove this to you by, if I click on it, there's the ripple effect, the famous ripple effect from Material UI, and this is visible here, and also we preserve functionality, because like, this is one of our main pillars. So now we see that Stardust introduces all the necessary capabilities for rich component customization, while preserving the essence of the component, its logic. Right now, we saw in this example that I'm using styles, inline styles, to actually define how the component looks like, but this is not really valid in a real app scenario. So, like, we might ask ourselves, okay, how can we achieve styling in a way that it preserves, it's not such a pain and a headache to maintain the consistency. So you might think about theming as a solution, and this is exactly what Stardust is attempting to use in order to tackle this problem. So let's now switch to a more like a real, let's say like a real application. So we have a prototype created here with, let me just try to maybe zoom out a little bit, or, okay. Is it still visible? I think so. So here we have, you might recognize this as the speakers page of the React website, React conference website, and this one is written using Stardust components. So let's take a look at the page, and we can identify a few of the areas here. At the top, we have a nav bar that contains the menu. Then we have an input, a grid of the speakers, and then at the bottom there is another menu here in the footer. So what are the benefits of using Stardust for this? Where would we have problems if we used another tool set instead of Stardust? Let's see how accessibility works. I'm just going to turn on VoiceOver here. Hope this doesn't break anything. And I want to use my keyboard actually for this part. So I promise I'm not going to touch the touchpad here. So I'm just using my keyboard. And now I'm navigating. I press tab to navigate there, and I'm pressing the arrow keys to navigate back and forth through the menu. And you can see maybe in the lower left corner that the screen reader is actually reading the menu, like schedule menu item, so it identifies this automatically. And then I can navigate with tab to the button, then I can navigate to the input here, I can filter these people. These are all Stardust components, so everything is working, like I'm just using the keyboard itself, and of course navigation through the grid itself with keys, and then at the end navigation in this menu, and I'm selecting with enter. Everything's fine. Let's look at the code for the top menu. So we have it here. This is it. This is just importing the menu Stardust component and identifying the item slot, specifying the items themselves, and there's no code related to accessibility. This comes, it's out of the box. It's part of the component's logic, and it just works. And we are going to prove how this will still be working even if we do major changes in styling. So I'm going to introduce now another benefit of Stardust, which is the ability to customize component styles by simply targeting component name by their names and specifying plain CSS and JS objects for that. So for these styles in the page, we created this default theme which contains just a JavaScript object, and it identifies in the component styles by their names, it identifies the components, and we just specify a regular object file. Let me turn off this voice editor. VoiceOver, okay, turned off. So this is how we were able to achieve styling, and now all these styles are assembled in the theme object that we are providing at the top of the tree, and it's provided to all these components through the React context. Now suppose that we want to tweak these styling aspects to introduce material flavor to the main page. So this is how the page looks right now. So we are going to introduce the elevation, the paper, and the layering effects. And for doing that, we introduced another theme where the material styles are provided. So I'm going to the index page, and where we are using here at the top of the page, the provider, I'm going to add the material theme, which is just like a very similar object that we have. It's this one. So I'm just going to save this file and go back here, and now we see that page is completely different. If I'm going to scroll, we see this effect at the navigation bar at the top. There is this paper effect and like the layering of the grid items. Backgrounds are different. So this is just by changing one object at the top of the tree. And like okay, let's go back to keyboard navigation and see how the functionality is still there. And yes, it is. I'm just using again the keys to navigate through these controls. Everything was like functionality is preserved, but the whole styling is completely changed and it looks like a different app almost. So just to recap, as we've seen, just by using Stardust components, we are able to address accessibility issues. We are able to introduce theming capabilities to a web page, and all the styles are now manageable through themes while preserving the whole functionality. Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm going to hand over to Hugh for wrapping up.
So, in summary, we hope that we're not actually introducing anything very new in Stardust. It's really much more just repackaging, re-abstracting a lot of the things which we've developed over the years and aligning around a common language. So it's relatively early days. We're at a 0-point release. We have a first React-based implementation of the components, and we've sort of proven that we think we can really abstract the keyboard navigation, the accessibility, and the theming out. Would I recommend you go and use Stardust tomorrow for your new project? Probably not. There's quite a lot more thinking to do about abstracting state and managing component states, and enriching the libraries, the component library and the theme library. If you'd like to help out with this, we'd love to hear from you. We're on GitHub under Stardust React, and we very much welcome your contributions. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying late and listening.
All right, a couple of questions for you, I believe. First one, what's the reason for forking?
Yeah.
The Semantic UI to create almost identical project instead of contributing to it?
Semantic UI is a great base. They have a lot of ideas which we're building on. They are not style agnostic. They have an opinion about how things should look. That's one of the things which we didn't want to take from Semantic UI. And the other thing is they don't cover accessibility in anything like the depth which we're doing. For sure, they have some keyboard navigation, but they definitely don't have the depth of role handling with the elements, ensuring the elements actually follow the W3 standards and so on in the actual components. So Semantic UI is fantastic. I think it's a great library. We're just trying to build on top of it and learn as much as we can from it.
In addition to this, I would say that I was actually trying to use Semantic UI to achieve some very basic styling issues, like styling things. And you can get really, because they're using static CSS and with all the styles are marked as important, it's very, very hard to customize these. So this is like one of the biggest issues that I have.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Is this a fork from Semantic UI?
And that's pretty much the same question.
Right. We can tackle
what I will say is, yes, it is a fork, and yes, the class names and things are similar, but they are diverging, yes. People have tried now to take Semantic UI and just change it for Stardust. It's getting more difficult to do that. We are diverging in a little bit in some concepts and aspects, but yeah, both great libraries, a lot of good stuff in Semantic UI.
All right, that is all we have time for. Whoever asked that final question, you're going to have to do it in person. All right, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.